Okay, in this lesson we're going to focus on a topic also from chapter 28, the specifically dermal tissue system, which is comprised of epidermis and periderm. And recall that the organs of the plant, root stems and leaves, contain dermal tissue in addition to the other types of tissues that we've talked about, ground tissue and vascular tissue systems. The purpose of dermal tissue is to provide a protective covering for the parts of the plant, including the roots, stems, and leaves. So this is a summary of what we just talked about, but giving a visual here to show you where that dermal tissue might be located here. This is showing for the cross section of the stem. So now we're going to learn a little bit more about the two complex tissues, the epidermis and the periderm. Epidermis is the outermost layer of the plant that covers leaves, young stems, and roots in herbaceous plants. The term herbaceous refers to plants that aren't woody plants. So as long as it's not like a woody twig or a tree, this would pertain to that. Okay, so woody plants are going to be talked about separately. The epidermal layer, or epidermis, is usually only one cell layer thick. That's not very thick at all. So, in fact, cells are usually transparent. So this allows for light to pass through so that the light can penetrate into the photosynthetic cells that are more interior in the parenchyma tissue. Now, oftentimes for a plant, the epidermis is unspecialized types of cells. They don't have a specific job other than to be there to provide that layer of protection. But sometimes there are specialized cells that make up the epidermis, like guard cells, shown on the right here. These are the cells that regulate the opening and closing of the stomata, which regulate gas exchange, where CO2, carbon dioxide, can enter the plant through those openings. Oxygen can be released and water vapor as well. Another specialized structure of the epidermis are trichomes. They look like hairs growing on the stems here, but it's actually a part of their epidermis. Okay, so now let's switch our focus on the woody plants. Instead of having an epidermis, they have periderm. This is the outermost layer of a woody stem or root. And the periderm is pretty interesting because it contributes to the increase in the girth of a woody plant. What allows it to, like a tree, to have a wider and wider trunk as it ages is because of the periderm and the different kind of cells that comprise it. Mostly, periderm is composed of cork cells. Cork cells are cells that, when they become mature, they are actually dead, not living, but they're still part of the living organism if it is still alive. Cork cells also have cell walls with a waterproof coating to help protect the plant from losing water. Another type of cell in the periderm are called cork parenchyma cells, and these are used for storage of food, water. So coming back to this overview of the plant organs, tissue systems, and tissues, that's actually where we're going to leave it for what we need to know about these, this hierarchy of classification for the organs, tissues. However, there is one type of tissue that's not reflected here. And it's very important to talk about this type of tissue because it allows the plants to grow taller and wider, and it's sort of like stem cells for plants. And the term for that tissue is called meristematic tissue. So this is the tissue that hasn't yet differentiated to become specialized. So these cells that make up the tissue, meristematic tissue, continue to make copies of themselves via mitosis to make more of those undifferentiated cells. This type of tissue is found usually in the young, immature tissue, not in the mature, older growth parts of the plant. And it's going to be focused in regions of active growth, areas that are accounting for increases in length and height, or areas that are accounting for increases in girth or width. As shown in the diagram on the right and color-coded with the little bullet points here in red and blue, the regions that increase in length and height account for primary growth of a plant. Regions that account for increases in girth or width are where secondary growth of the plant takes place. So we're going to spend a little time now talking more about primary and secondary growth and how that occurs. There are these, the locations called apical meristems at the tips of roots and shoots where the meristematic tissue responsible for primary growth takes place. As shown here, we're zooming now into the shoot apical meristem and the root apical meristem. So the cells there are mitotically active, making copies of themselves, also causing elongation of the cells themselves and sometimes of the whole plant because of what's happening in those apical meristems. Let's take a closer look now at the apical meristem of a shoot. Within that apical meristem of the shoot, there's 3 primary tissues. They're listed here and shown in the microscopic image at the right with the labels. You can see here this dark little bubble area, that's the apical meristem. So let's read about this together here. Protoderm is the tissue in the apical meristem that gives rise to the epidermis and the periderm in woody plants. So a way you can remember that is that protoderm means before derm, and it leads to the formation of the dermal tissue. Periderm and epidermis, which are dermal tissue, comes from protoderm. Ground meristem gives rise to the ground tissue, specifically the cortex and the pith. Procambium gives rise to the primary xylem and phloem, or vascular tissue. That's the only one that might be a bit challenging to remember. I think the other 2 give some hints as to what they give rise to. Now these are the same terms that would be applied to the meristems in the root, the apical meristems of the root. So we're not going to look at that, but know that they are the same types of tissues within the root apical meristems. So a few other things I wanted to point out on the microscopic image here at the right. Again, that's a shoot apical meristem. We're looking at it really, really close up. So that apical meristem area is where those new cells are being made, giving rise to these other types of tissues. In addition, so you just have a little bit more of an idea of what we're looking at here. The leaf primordium, these are tiny embryonic leaves that develop into mature leaves. They're like the little baby leaves starting to form as the shoot continues to elongate. And the bud primordia also here at the base develop into the buds. You can also see some other structures labeled, like the protoderm here, the procambium, and ground meristem. So all of those tissues are shown here. Now you wouldn't have to be able to label a diagram like this, don't worry about that, but I do want you to know the content of this information, what each of these types of tissues does for the plant, and how these are all types of apical meristem tissue. All right, so that was primary growth, how primary growth occurs. But remember, secondary growth leads to an increase in the girth of a woody plant. And this takes place in lateral meristems. And these lateral meristems extend the length of stems and roots except at the tip, which is where the apical meristems are going to be. There are two types of lateral meristems. They're called vascular cambium and cork cambium. The vascular cambium is a thin continuous cylinder between the wood and the bark of that woody plant. It's shown here in green. The cork cambium is a thin cylinder or irregular arrangement in the outer bark region. So that's shown here as part of the periderm. So I think something interesting to think about is that when a tree gets larger, as the trunk of the tree gets wider, increases in girth, there are certain tissues within that tree that are causing that expansion. Not all of the tissues can do that, only these types, vascular cambium, cork cambium. And so just kind of seeing where they are is interesting because it's not the outermost layer that gets thicker. It's actually something that's inside of that and it's causing it to push out and make that tree trunk much wider. So let's zoom in and take a closer look at an herbaceous eudicot stem at the vascular cambium that's between the primary xylem and the primary phloem, which, by the way, primary xylem and primary phloem are the first xylem and phloem to emerge on a developing plant. So if we look at this cross-section of the eudicot stem at the vascular bundle here, showing it really close up, you can see the phloem, this pink area here, smaller cells, and then the xylem, the bigger ones, more interior to the phloem. Usually xylem is more interior to the phloem, but then between them, you have the vascular cambium. Vascular cambium is going to produce the secondary xylem and secondary phloem, which, like the primary xylem and phloem, also involve transport of water, minerals, and food. But the reason that secondary xylem and phloem are sometimes needed is because the plant is getting larger, more complex, and has maybe a greater need for food and water transportation, and also wastes that it might need to get rid of. Now, if we look at how this applies to a woody plant, in a woody eudicot stem, the secondary xylem is actually the wood. And it's this wood that you can see in the purple area there. It's shown in this manner as these concentric rings because this is how we can age trees. During different seasons, there's differences in the size of the xylem, the secondary xylem, because in the spring versus the summer versus the fall versus the winter, there's going to be differences in the growth rate and deposit of the secondary xylem compared to the phloem. So that's kind of a fun fact for the day about how we can understand why trees have these rings that we might use to determine their age. It has to do with the pattern of the secondary xylem compared to the secondary phloem. Another thing I find really interesting about woody plants and xylem is that sometimes these plants get so old that parts of them are not actually alive anymore. It's still part of the plant, but the plant doesn't need it to survive. When looking at a cross-section of the trunk of a tree here, is showing the different kinds of xylem. The living xylem is known as the sapwood, and the inactive xylem is called the heartwood. The sapwood needs to be closer to the vascular cambium because that's where active growth is still happening, where the cells are alive, versus the heartwood, which is usually in the center, that's older. It can actually rot out, and the tree can still be alive even though the heartwood has been removed from it. And that's why there are these big trees that have been kind of carved out into tunnels so that cars can drive through. The tree is actually still alive, and that really didn't cause any harm to the tree because they carved out the heartwood. And finally, the bark of the tree includes the tissues outside the vascular cambium, which include the secondary phloem. So again, this isn't the primary phloem that would be when the plant was young and starting to grow, but formed later in its life as it matured.